Hello, everybody. Chris Jerome from the Radical Independent Facebook page, and today I'm talking with Elizaveta Friesen. Thanks for chatting with me, Elizaveta.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
So, you've got quite the range of interests. If you go to your website, elizavetafriesen.com, you've got some poetry, you've got some art, but I think maybe mainly you're a writer, an editor, a scholar. I believe you have two doctorates. Is that right?
Yes, yes, I do.
And extensive writings on your website. You've got the blog, you got a newsletter people can sign up for, and a book or two. And that's kind of the main focus, I think, for now.
Mhm.
Is I kind of wanted to get into the book. But can you give me some of your background and kind of how you got started in the subject of communication?
Well, I'm originally from Russia, and I came here about 15 years ago to continue my education. So that's where I got my second doctorate degree. My first degree was very broad and interdisciplinary and gave me a great foundation in a variety of social sciences and humanities, history, philosophy, anthropology,
Right.
psychology, you name it. So I see myself as a very interdisciplinary scholar, and I enjoy drawing on very different but interconnected fields and disciplines. So my second degree that I came to do in the United States was specifically in media and communication.
Mhm.
So that's how I ended up being interested in that, but it really fits into my broader passion and understanding the human nature and also the nature of human conflict and thinking of ways how people can coexist better.
Right. Just a comment on the whole interdisciplinary thing. I think it's really underrated because people kind of get focused and become really expert in this one area, but then they sometimes don't know how to make the connections and put the pieces together. So kind of having that broad outlook area of study is kind of cool. So you have a book and it's pretty awesome. It's called
Thank you.
Media is Us: Understanding Communication and Moving Beyond Blame. Obviously a lot of what you talk about is pretty universal, right? It applies to the widest range of human interaction. But the radical independent, I'm dealing mainly with that social political aspect, but it
Mhm.
fits. I mean, it doesn't really matter. Just in terms of what I post on the web on the Radical Independent, I'm kind of looking at the civil discourse, the civic dialogue that we're having, and I think the book applies really well in that area. Can you give kind of just a quick rundown of the gist of the book?
Well, I started writing this book because I just finished my program in media and communication, and I learned a lot. I enjoyed it a lot, but I felt that there was something was missing and something that I wanted to express. Something in all the scholarship and conversations that exist about media, I felt this kind of undercurrent or some kind of taste, like flavor of blame,
Right,
that all the time it was like about somebody else doing things to us. And media was often described in these terms. It's something outside of us that can negatively affect us, right? And we need to figure out how to protect us or our children. And I mean, there's an element of it's not like entirely untrue that yes, there are maybe somebody else writes something or does something using media technology that we need to understand better how that works, right? But it doesn't mean that it's always like us versus them. And I
right.
felt that I wanted to talk about that. And I came up with this book's title when I was in the very beginning, when I was just conceiving the idea. And it stayed with me and it really guided me because I realized that that's what I want to talk about, how media is not something like we shouldn't look at it as something
External.
outside of us that other people do to us, right? We need to
Right,
see ourselves as part of this whole communication system in order to be able to make things better for ourselves and for others. Because if it's only blame, then we don't take any responsibility
right,
for what we ourselves are
right.
doing.
I think I might be wrong, but there was an article that kind of led me to you, and I think it was called "It's Not About Them." And that's kind of what you're mentioning here, how, fighting against polarization and stuff like that, a lot of it is just challenging yourself. And it's like you said, when you're going through the academics, it was just all very external and them and this and that. But kind of getting into that aspect of challenging yourself and starting with yourself, right? The media is us, basically. So
Hmm.
that's interesting.
Yeah.
So, I know you talk a lot about the communication aspect, five fundamentals, principles of communication that describe interactions. It doesn't matter if it was 1,000 years ago or today. The principles exist, but our culture is constantly changing.
Hmm.
So maybe talk a little bit about that. How things have changed today. That principles are universal, but how things are changing today has an effect on how we're talking with each other.
Well, I think you're pointing out a very important thing that those two things can be true at the same time. There's some underlying principles that we can find in human communication thousands of years ago and today. So these things are parallel. But at the same time, it would be wrong to say, well, it's always the same, right?
Right.
Obviously, when people didn't have screens everywhere, it was different. Right? When you wouldn't be able to write something that would then be read by like thousands or maybe millions of people, depending on how things turn out to be, right? That didn't happen. So I think we definitely should take into consideration how communication works today through the modern forms of technology, and be careful, right, about that, right?
Right.
Because you could things that you say in the past, could affect maybe like a small circle, immediate circle of people who you knew, and then maybe over time it could affect others. But nowadays, especially if somebody who has bigger following, they say something, and this creates huge ripples in the world, and it's just something to be really care about. We should be
Right.
very
And
careful
I,
about it.
I think that's a big topic in these circles, just the growth of the media with technology and how it's really changed the civic landscape, well, life in general, right? I mean, we're carrying around phones that, the internet at our fingertips. The media is always there now. Like you can't avoid it. And the communication that exists, this topic really fascinates me because you talk about mutual interdependence to a certain degree and stuff like that. I often think about paradox and how, like, in many situations, we exist sort of simultaneously in two kind of contradictory states. I think about that a lot, and I think this kind of applies there because you're talking a little bit about micro power and macro power. Can you kind of explain that a little bit?
So as I was writing this book, I wasn't sure where I'm going to go with it. And I really let the process take over and kind of lead me to some new insights. And as I was writing this book, I realized that I needed to talk about power. And that's how I started writing about power, which actually now is one of the key topics that I'm working on in a different project. Because so I wanted to talk about media and this flavor or undercurrent of blame that I felt in conversations about media. And then I thought, well, when we talk about blame or when we experience blame, it's something about power because, well, first of all, we say, well, there are some people in power who, send messages or shape media landscape, and it's totally up to them how to improve things, like going to extreme, right? And say, well, it's just them. They need to fix stuff, right? But in general, blame. Like I wanted getting really philosophical, and I said to myself, like, okay, well, what is blame? It's when I say to somebody, well, it's your fault, right? Blame is when I say it's your fault, right? And I say
Right.
it means you could have done things differently, right? But you did it that way, this way, and it was bad. Or or you can change things, but you're not doing that, so you do have power. So, and then I started thinking about how these things are much more complicated, and you use the word paradox now, and I realized that paradox is is really a key word when we're trying to describe human experiences and human condition
Yeah.
is that human beings are embedded in society and make up society, right? So society shapes us, but we are shaping it, and it's
Right.
like this constant loop. And in this process, it's very hard. I found that it's very hard to find somebody who you would say, well, this is like an ultimately powerful person or group of people that shape how things are. Because everybody to a certain extent has a level of powerlessness in them and a certain potential for power, although that changes a lot. Like we shouldn't just generalize and say everybody has the same amount of
Right.
those aspects in them, right? So, and that's in that chapter. So I wrote a separate chapter, Paradoxes of Power, in that book, and I came up with this theory I called theory of micro and macro power. And basically, I said that I'm not denying that there are power imbalances in a sense, like, somebody can do something that the other person cannot do, or somebody can affect somebody while they cannot affect them in return. But so when we look at a specific situation, like a very basic, like a micro, a group, like two people, three
Sure.
people, it's easier to see in this situation who has a power over whom, at least in a short period of time. But once you start zooming out and introducing other people, you start seeing how things are much more complicated. As somebody who has a power over another person in a certain situation, that person is affected by some other factors and some other constraints.
Right.
And then if you take the most possible like global view of all human relationships, like in imaginary situation over space and time, you see that so super complicated. You cannot say this is a powerful person or this is a powerful group, because it's all interconnected and intertwined and affecting everything and everybody. So
Right.
in that's where I used micro and macro power, because on a smallest possible level, you can see one thing, but then you zoom out and you see a different kind of relationship.
Maybe it's the micro macro to me, and I might be off. I mean, there might be very little relationship, but it sounds similar to Adam Smith's Invisible Hand because you talk about millions and millions of smaller interactions happening, pairs of people, small groups. But this sort of combines to create sort of a larger whole that sort of
Mhm,
moves fluidly and
mhm.
sort of adapts on the fly and this interaction. I don't know. Maybe it's not exactly the same, but
No,
I feel
I
like it.
think it is another form of that. Like
Okay.
that's why I'm working on a different project now that is about power that I just mentioned. And I'm finding a lot of different ideas and scholars who talked about the things that can be connected back to this idea of like how power is
Right.
complicated and how human interactions are all about paradoxes. So I didn't go into the invisible hand idea yet, but thank you for giving these
Yeah.
ideas, because
Well,
I think I'll mention it at
there's
some point.
a really interesting video. It's like 5 minutes. It's called I Pencil, the movie, but maybe YouTube it. I'd like to kind of maybe if we talk again at some point, I'd like some sort of follow up or even an email. I would like to see what you think about that. It's called I
Sure.
Pencil, the movie, and I don't know why it's called the movie. It's like 5 minutes long, but it's interesting because it kind of gets into the Adam Smith's idea, which like you said, it kind of relates a little bit to the topic of communication in general and that
Yeah.
power structure.
Yeah. Yeah.
So of course, my primary focus is our political polarization leading to toxic dysfunction and the partisanship, the emotional tribalism, and stuff like that.
Mhm.
And as the polarization gets worse, our dysfunction seems to, get to more dangerous and destructive levels. So I think just understanding the dynamics of communication and how that works. You talk about awareness, and that's kind of like the first step, I guess. And
Mhm.
that's kind of where I'm on the radical independent, just kind of spreading the word, like, hey, look, this is a problem.
Mhm.
What are
Mhm.
some causes? What are some effects? Stuff like that. How it's manifesting, creating the negative emotions, and but then so that way we can kind of get to the next step, right, with sort of reversing it, and maybe kind of healing the civic landscape. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about in terms of of the book, any other key ideas that maybe sort of apply to what we're talking about?
There are a lot of different ideas in the
Yeah,
book.
yeah,
I
that's a
mean, I
tough
can
question,
now.
huh? It's like, where do I? Yeah.
Uh, yeah, I mean, the book was published, well, it was like 5 years ago,
Okay,
and I'm building on it because yeah, so things that I'm doing now are connected to it,
right.
growing out of the book, but it's, I'm taking things on a new level, sort of.
Could you talk a little bit about your current project?
Oh, okay. Well, when it might be out, that's a tricky one because I realized, so what happened after I published this book, I felt like there were so many things that were left out, so many
Mm,
ideas, because
yeah,
when you're writing a book or even when you're writing an article or an essay, you can feel like, you have to cut things out, right? And kind of stay on track with what you're trying to say. And so I started to think like, okay, how am I going to tackle this? Like I had ideas for different other books. Well, maybe I'm trying to choose the next idea. And then I felt I don't want to choose this specific idea. I want to explore different directions and different ideas
right,
kind of simultaneously and be
right,
free in this sense. So I decided why don't I do this hypertext project where I just have essays that are interconnected and I explore. So it's a writing, but it's also an exploration and scholarly process. And I started one such project on my website that you mentioned, elizavetafriesem.com, and I called it Me Looking for Meaning, like a very broad and philosophical, almost like self-exploration, but also exploration of bigger questions related to the human condition. Because in that book, one thing that I realized that I'm really interested in is the idea of meaning, right? That human
right,
beings as
right,
meaning making or meaning seeking creatures that, see the world always through some kind of ideas in their heads and impose meanings on the world around them. And that's why I call this project Me Looking for Meaning. And I'm still working on it. It became kind of like a playground for ideas. But then I realized that I really want to drill into the topic of power. And I created a separate website for it. And I called that project Power of Meanings, Meanings of Power.
hmm,
You asked me when, the result will be out or something. Like, I don't know because I realize that I don't want to give myself a timeline or, I just explore things and I write things out and I make connections and I share some of the essays on my blog. So my blog is the best place to see sort of the latest updates on what I feel like I finished a certain essay. I put it there. Sometimes I put things on LinkedIn, and I also have a newsletter that's you can sign up for on my website. Yeah, so so I'm continuing this ideas that I started in exploring in the book, but it's really I'm letting them grow into all sorts of
right. It
directions.
seems like the best way, just kind of let it happen organically and naturally and not put a lot of artificial like timelines or, I got to get
Yeah,
this idea across. Just kind of let it go fluidly. And then at some point you're like, well, it's ready. Whenever that happens, right?
yeah, yeah.
You have a quote on your website from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. And that really kind of hits home, I think, with some of the themes that I
Mhm.
go over with the radical independent. I talk about the vicious polarization, how we got to come together, we got to do better, we got to be better. We can't be manipulated by this nonsense. And this, it just struck me because it obviously describes a lot of what you go over, kind of, that theme sort of applies as well as to me. Do you want to say anything about that particular quote? Because I look at it like we're in this binary where each side's just attacking the other, and it's
Mhm.
not even really about policy to me. It seems almost it's almost just a social thing now that they're the other side
Mhm.
group and they're my enemy, and
Mhm.
they think that by voting harder and hating harder and fighting harder, we're gonna make things better. And I feel like that's a dead end road to failure. Like
Mhm.
there's no life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness down this path. So we have to change. And there's a lot of good books out there. Like I think it's called Love Your Enemies. by Arthur
Mm.
C. Brooks and a bunch of ones like that. But we have to change ourselves and change the way we're interacting with each other, on that at that group level, politically. But tell me what that quote means to you.
Well, I really admire Martin Luther King, and I'm inspired by his work, but also work of other people who put the idea of nonviolence in the
Yeah,
center of their work, like, Gandhi and people before them. There's a whole line of people who, and people currently doing this work. There's a Center of Nonviolent Communication that was founded by Marshall Rosenberg. That's a really also really important and interesting work. But for me, this idea of compassion, right, the value of compassion, and there's also empathy, the kind of overlapping terms. And I understand that the word love can be a tough pill to swallow for people because especially, if you imagine like somebody that you really don't like, right?
right,
And I think everybody has somebody like that. Even the kindest, nicest people have somebody they don't like, and going and what does it mean like to love your enemy? So I understand that it can be an intimidating thought, but it doesn't have to be like literally going and becoming like buddies with your worst enemy or
right. It's not what that means. Yeah,
like I think that the idea of compassion for me, what is compassion? It is some people might feel like it's something touchy-feely, it's not scholarly, it's not really practical, but for me it's crucial because I think it's actually an emotional and cognitive practice that allows us to see other people as human beings and to practice curiosity towards them and be interested in who they are and why they act the way they act. So I might, if I imagine like somebody that I really dislike, I might not want to go and try to be their best friend, but I can think about them as a human being and wonder, be curious about what led them or leading them to do things
right,
that I might not be a big fan of, right? And I think this can be a start. And I think on one of the essays that I published in that project, Me Looking for Meaning, was something about this idea of loving your enemy. And I said something there that it really starts with changing your mindset. Because if you approach the world as, the world where there are enemies that don't deserve your compassion and don't deserve your time to trying to understand them, then the world will be filled with those enemies for you. Like this is just, you will find those enemies, right? But if you decide that you're not going to see people this way, that it's worth looking for something deeper in people, even if you don't agree with their actions, even if you see that their actions are harmful, it doesn't mean that, loving your enemy doesn't mean that you accept everything and, you're fine with everything everybody else is doing, right? You can still work to protect those who are being hurt or to reduce suffering, and that might involve trying to affect somebody's behaviors, but it doesn't need to happen through hate, right? You can do that, and that's what Martin Luther King was talking about, right? He was trying to change things
right,
and trying to reduce suffering that was like major suffering at his in his
right.
lifetime, right?
Yeah,
But he was saying we shouldn't do that through hatred, and that's why he was going back to that quote that you mentioned, right? So he wasn't saying, we should just sit together and sing Kumbaya and just forget about all our troubles. He didn't say that, right? But he
right.
said like we need to fight, but we can see people we are fighting against as human beings. So that's
I
what
think
I
that's
think that we
how.
should keep in mind.
Yeah, I mean, for democracy to function, and I think a lot of people sort of forget this, that you have to basically see your fellow man as equals and as a human being.
Mhm.
Because once the contempt, it's like a cancer, right? It just starts eating away at our
Yeah,
cells and our foundation, and
yeah,
just approaching it. It's hard. It's a hard thing to do. These people,
absolutely.
some of the ideas I find terrible, reprehensible. It's a
Mm,
tough thing to do to kind of be able to challenge yourself to, you don't agree with those
mm,
ideas, but this is a person, a fellow citizen. and I can engage with them on a certain level, that's going to be a lot more productive than the
Mhm.
intense, vicious
Mhm.
contempt and partisan anger. Yeah,
Yeah.
those are great ideas. Well, I want to thank you again. It's great to be able to talk to you. Very enlightening ideas on a very important subject as well.
Thank
So,
you.
thanks for talking with me.
Thank you for having me.
Take care.